Today we're going to talk about ecology, and let's start off by defining what ecology actually is. Ecology is the study of the interactions between living and non-living organisms. That is to say, the interaction between organisms in the environment and the environment itself. As we consider ecology, we have to define some terms very specifically in order to be accurate in our discussion, and one of those is the idea of a population. When you speak of a population in ecology, what you mean is a group of organisms that can interbreed and coexist together. So when an ecologist uses the term population, he has a specific idea of what he wants to communicate, and that is this idea of organisms that can interbreed and exist together. The term community obviously has many meanings, but in the world of ecology, the word community means a group of populations living and interacting together in the same area. So a community is several different groups, separate groups of interbreeding organisms coexisting together that live and interact with each other in the same area or location. Now, as we expand our discussion to greater and greater areas of understanding, we have to understand what the idea of an ecosystem is. I know when I was in high school, we didn't talk in terms of an ecosystem, but nowadays it's common to hear this term thrown around. When a person who knows what they're talking about says that they're talking about an ecosystem, they're talking about the association of living organisms with their physical environment. So when they say that this situation in this ecosystem, they're specifically talking about the living organisms in a particular area of the planet or someplace, and that environment that those organisms are in, whether they're in the mountains or the desert or whatever. So here's some examples of some ecosystems. And in the term ecosystem, there's also other terms. Here's the idea of the ecosystem. They're living in their physical environment, but within an ecosystem, you can have a smaller community. Remember what we meant by community of plants. You can also have what's known as a habitat, which is a living space for a particular organism. And then that is within a particular ecosystem. And then a term that probably most of you have not heard before, and that is the term biome. And biome is when you take groups of ecosystems, groups of interactions between organisms in their physical environment, and you classify those by the climate and the plant life that live in that area. So let's take a look at what is meant by a biome. One particular biome is called the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest is defined by the amount of rain that occurs. It has to be over a certain amount of rain, and how hot the temperature is. And so those are the climatary conditions that are required to call something a tropical rainforest. Then, in addition to that, there are certain types of plants that live in a tropical rainforest. And therefore, that also has to be present for this classification to be rendered upon a particular area or particular biome. An example of a tropical rainforest is the Amazon Delta, where the Amazon River travels through South America. Now, if the temperature doesn't quite make it to call it tropical, but there's enough rain to call it a rainforest, then it's called a temperate rainforest. And on the other end of these two spectra of high rain, you also have low rain, a desert. You'll notice over here it talks about precipitation, so that's the amount of rain, and over here is the annual temperature. So it's the temperature and the rain that determine this this classification. And so as you move greater and greater temperatures, you see that you can go from a temperate is a term that's used for intermediate range, an intermediate range of temperatures, and then it's rainforest versus forest versus shrubland, and then intermediate temperatures can also be seen in deserts. But then if you have very low temperatures and low rain, then it's not called a desert anymore, it's called a tundra. And so this is how biomes are classified, and this is what is meant by a biome. Now when I was in high school, we used to talk about the tropical rainforest and the temperate rainforest and the desert, but we did not speak about those with the term biome. We just called those various different places or environments. Now this pyramid is a pyramid that's similar to the pyramid that's in your book, and now we're going to talk about energy and energy change in an ecosystem. As we've talked about before, organisms that produce their own food are called producers. They're also called autotrophs. Auto meaning self, and troph meaning providing your own food. We've also talked about the term consumer, and you can have organisms that use food that is made by producers or other consumers. Now, for ecology, they actually break the consumers down, as you can see on this diagram, into more than one type. One is called a primary consumer. A primary consumer is an organism that gets its food directly from a producer. And because almost all producers, matter of fact, I think I could say all producers, are plants, then these are generally called herbivores. Although animals that also eat other consumers can eat plants, this would not be considered a primary consumer. So a primary consumer is an organism that gets its food directly from producers and is always a herbivore. A secondary consumer is one that eats primary consumers. A tertiary consumer is one that eats secondary consumers. Now the distinction between these are not 100%. That is, it's not impossible for, say, an eagle to eat a rabbit, but generally this is the way it goes. So we are talking about here are what's known as trophic levels or energy levels. And so you start out with the first trophic level, which is always a producer level, which always represents some form of plant life. These producers get their energy from the sun, and they are available to the primary consumer. Now the primary consumer, being a herbivore, always gets its energy from eating the producers. So that's the second trophic level, the first trophic level of which you'll see animals and not just plants. Then a secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, and subsequently the tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. Now what this shows is that at each level, energy is lost. You have a loss of energy between the producer and the primary consumer, between the primary consumer and the secondary consumer. And that's why you have a large box down here with a very large amount of heat. The box gets smaller with less heat. A kilocal is a measure of heat. The box gets even smaller with less heat, with more heat loss here. And then lastly, the box is very small with a lot of heat loss. And so as you move up these trophic levels, you'll see the loss of heat. And that's shown here as well, and that has a name. That's called the food chain. This is called a food chain. And they've actually added a quaternary level or quaternary consumer as well. You may have heard on television or in other environments the idea of being at the top of the food chain. Well, that means you're up here, which means you don't have any natural predators. So if you're at the top of the food chain, it's thought to be you're pretty safe. If you're down here, life is a little bit more interesting. Now the other thing, so this food chain term is another term that's used for the trophic energy levels. Now this rule is an absolute rule in environment and in ecology, and that is energy is always lost as you move up the food chain, up levels of the food chain. And in general, it's not just some energy, but it's a lot of energy is lost as you move up the food chain. So let's take a look at these food chains and let's answer some questions here with the sun. And which one of these, and you can stop the tape if you need to think about it, but which one of these would be the most likely producer that would get its energy from the sun, and also that would end up being eaten by a zebra? The answer is grass. Now plankton can get its energy from the sun, but zebras don't eat plankton. But grass is the only other plant on here, and grass can be eaten by a zebra. And then what is the most likely secondary consumer of this zebra? And if you look at this list, it's possible that humans could eat zebras, but more likely lions eat zebras. And so on this example, we go from sun to grass to zebra to lion, and that's the food chain in this first box. So let's look at the second box. We have sun to algae, and then we have two steps that you have to decide, and then a raccoon. And think in terms of algae growing in the water. You can see that a moth and there's snails on here twice, so that's probably not the right answer either. But it might be. And then caterpillar. Caterpillars don't live in the water. Moths don't live in the water. So snail, whale, or snail. Now, is it likely that a whale is going to be eaten by anything in this box? Probably not. So let's go back and say that the most likely answer here is one of these two snails, either one. So then you have to decide which one of these is most likely to eat a snail and also to be eaten by a raccoon. And I would say that if you look at these, the most likely is a fish. Obviously, crow, grass, and a lion don't go into the water and eat fish. So you're stuck with starfish or fish. Starfish live in the ocean. Raccoons don't go to the ocean. So fish is your most likely answer. Let's look at the next one. You start out with the sun, plants, and then something that is ultimately eaten by a jaguar. Something that will eat a plant but is ultimately eaten by a jaguar. Now, of these choices, unfortunately for me, when I brought this slide, I don't actually know what a javelina is. But I think that's the right answer, because the rest of these are not likely to either eat a plant or be eaten by a jaguar. An anaconda might eat a plant. It doesn't, but it might. But it won't be eaten by a jaguar. It also doesn't eat plants. A falcon doesn't eat plants. A spider might eat plants, but it's not eaten by jaguars, and grass doesn't eat plants. So the most likely answer is a javelina, although I would have to look that up to see what that is. I don't actually know what a javelina is. The next one, we start with grass, or the sun, grass, something that eats grass, and then a snake. Now, which one of these eats grass? Well, a weasel might eat grass. A spider is pretty unlikely. A seaweed doesn't eat grass. A wolverine might. And a cricket doesn't eat grass. So wolverine and weasel are the most likely. Now, which one of these is most likely to be preyed on by a snake? And I would say a weasel as opposed to a wolverine. A wolverine is a vicious animal that most snakes would probably get torn to pieces if they tried to eat a wolverine, but a weasel they could probably handle. And then which one of these would probably eat the snake? Well, a moose is a herbivore. Sheep are herbivores. Goats are herbivores. And an ant is not going to eat a snake, so the most likely answer here is owl.